President Franklin D. Roosevelt, often called FDR, took office in 1933. It was the height of the Great Depression, the greatest economic crisis in U.S. history. In his first term in office, FDR and Congress enacted a series of programs known as the New Deal to help the economy recover and put people back to work. Although born wealthy, Eleanor Roosevelt had been the champion of the poor and disadvantaged all her life, as a social worker, a teacher, and then the First Lady. When her husband was elected president, she looked for ways to use her influential position to help the millions of Americans who were suffering because of the Depression.
Travel had been difficult for FDR since 1921 when he contracted polio and lost his use of his legs. Eleanor became his eyes, ears, and legs, crossing the country listening to the stories of struggling Americans.
In 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt travels more than 38,000 miles visiting slums, farms, factories, and mining towns across America. Often she is accompanied by Lorena Hickok, known as Hick, a former journalist. Hickok was hired by FDR to travel the country and report on the impact of his New Deal program. Hickok has brought Mrs. Roosevelt to a poor neighborhood in New York City. The women pass barefoot, children begging for food, and a bread line that stretches across the corner.
I'm amazed at how much suffering exists in the world. I'll never complain about my own circumstances again.
Do you think the government programs are helping people?
I believe they are giving some people hope. The CCC men are happy to be working, but many people have been left out of the New Deal. Do you know who I think needs the most help?
Who?
I'll show you. Roosevelt and Hickok knock on an apartment door. The woman who opens it is pale and thin. Her clothes are torn. The tiny apartment is dingy and sparse. Hello, Ruth. Do you remember me? I visited last week. I want you to meet someone. This is Miss Roosevelt.
Miss who?
Ruth, would you mind talking with her for a moment?
I'm not in trouble, am I?
No, of course not. Jones leads the two visitors to a table in the middle of the room where another sad-eyed woman is reading a newspaper.
Anna, this is Miss Roosevelt, the First Lady.
Well, wow! It's an honor to meet you, Miss Roosevelt.
A pleasure to meet you both. I'm here to learn more about what you're going through and how the government can help.
Ruth, Anna, could you tell Miss Roosevelt about your life here?
We worked on sewing machines at a factory downtown, but it's closed now for 2 years.
3 other women live here, too.
5 of you live in this little apartment?
Yes, ma'am.
What brought the other women here?
One had a husband who worked in a bank. When he lost his job, he just disappeared. The other 2 are sisters who moved to the city from a farm, looking for work. But they're still looking.
How do you get along? We eat what we can find, whatever people will give us.
Sometimes we stand in the bread lines or go to soup kitchens, but we hate that.
Bread lines, but those are for people who need help, like you. Why do you hate them? It's embarrassing.
If we had husbands, they would stand in the lines. Doing it ourselves shows that we're all alone.
It makes us feel like failures. It sounds like you ladies want to work.
Of course we do.
We've lost our jobs, just the same as men have, but everyone seems to think jobs should go only to them.
Nobody seems to care about the single woman.
When the visitor is over, Jones and Pierce watch through a window as Roosevelt and Hickok walk back to their car.
She doesn't look fancy enough to be the president's wife.
It was her, all right. She just looked just like in the newspapers.
I've never heard of a first lady traveling around, talking to people like us. I thought they just hosted fancy parties.
Miss Roosevelt isn't like the other first ladies. She always has worked. She used to be a teacher here in the city.
Most people think it's strange for any woman to want to work. What must they think of her?
It seemed like she really listened to us.
Look, the president's wife is driving her own car. Doesn't she have a chauffeur?
Maybe she just likes doing things herself.
Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt have tea with Harry Hopkins, one of the president's closest advisors in the White House. An architect of the New Deal, Hopkins oversees the CCC and other job programs. Mr. President, I think you'll be pleased with the work the CCC is doing. I could use some good news. In Wyoming, the men have begun planting trees that will keep the soil in our national parks from eroding. They are repairing roads in Texas and helping construct the new Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Isn't it great, Eleanor, that these once idle men now have a purpose? They can provide for their families while strengthening the nation.
You know, I think it's a wonderful program. In fact, I want to talk to you about expanding it to include women.
I'm not sure the public will support programs just for women. We can't even find enough jobs for the men.
Women are hurting too. Married women are struggling to provide for their families while their husbands are out of work. And single women have nowhere to turn. Hick and I visited a tiny apartment in New York where 5 single women are practically starving. A program could help these women find relief and job training.
If I may, Mr. President, I believe Mrs. Roosevelt is right. Women have been left out of our efforts. With your support, I'd like to explore the idea. I'll think it over.
I believe I have just the thing.
With the President's support, the First Lady creates Camp Terra near Bear Mountain, about 45 miles north of New York City. It's the first camp to provide relief and job training to unemployed single women.
The First Lady soon visits Camp Terra. She and the camp's director stroll through the wooded grounds.
Women sleep in barracks. Barracks just like the men do at CCC camps. They wake up with the sun for meals, take classes, and receive job training. This is the camp helping the women. Many women come here exhausted. They're malnourished. They need rest, food, and medical care, all of which they get here. Over here is the pond where they can swim and get exercise. What kind of job training do they receive? They all have shifts in the greenhouse, learning to work with plants. We also have educational and secretarial classes for the women.
After the tour, Eleanor Roosevelt calls help.
Harry, it's a beautiful camp, but they aren't doing enough. Only 30 women on here.
I know, Mrs. Roosevelt. There have been some delays and problems with the paperwork.
But there are hundreds, thousands of women who would benefit from being here.
Mrs. Roosevelt, you have to understand that we're up against what we're up against. Not everyone believes women should receive government relief, and not everyone thinks a First Lady should be as involved in policy making as you are.
Harry, you know I'm not one to keep quiet. By 1936, 19 women's camps have been created across the country. Though never as big as the men's CCC camps, they provide relief to more than 9,000 women and brought attention to their struggles.
During her time as First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt continued to fight for laws and programs to help women and underprivileged groups. She also voiced her opinions in speeches, writings, and press conferences. After leaving the White House in 1945, she became a delegate to the United States and a champion of human rights around the world. Throughout her life, she showed that women could be as independent and as powerful as men. In doing so, she became one of the most influential women of the 20th century.